Hey everyone, earlier this summer I had the delightful opportunity to talk with JD Lyonhart, or Jonathan Lyonhart, who is the writer of the book Monothreeism. It's a wonderful, wonderful little book of essentially Trinitarian metaphysics that I really loved. I really loved this book. The subtitle, since you probably can't read it on the video, is An Absurdly Arrogant Attempt to Answer All the Problems of the Last 2,000 Years in One Night in a Pub. And the tone of that subtitle indicates to you the kind of playful um, irreverence in a sense, but it's actually deeply intellectually reverent case in the book that he makes, but it's just a really unique flavor and style of book that's defending classical Trinitarian metaphysics. I really love this book, and I love the chance to talk to JD. And it's probably the most I've laughed in one of my interview conversations that I've had yet. We talk about his experience in academia. We talk about his decision to write a book in this style. We do get into a lot of the kind of meat and potatoes of the thought behind the book. Like, we talk about his terminology that he uses for the Trinity and why it's so important to have a really robust, deep ontological kind of defense of the Trinity that actually affects a lot of what we consider apologetics issues in our day and age. We get into all that stuff. It was really fun. He's a writer and a thinker that I'm excited to continue to follow. At the end of the conversation, we talk about all the stuff that he's working on coming out, and so I hope that I'll be able to talk to him again as more of his work continues to get published. But this was a really fun conversation, just a really enjoyable time. I hope that you enjoy it as much as I did. Without any further ado, here's my conversation with Jonathan Lyonhart. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. So I found out about your book because I'm a fan of OnScript. So I heard your interview with Chris Tilling on that feed, and then just thought it sounded like something that was right up my alley, and so that's how I found it. And then I heard about your podcast through maybe when I Googled your name after I got your book. And I've like gone back and listened to almost all the episodes of your podcast, actually, because it just is like, I really dig it. Honestly, it's great. I love what you guys are doing.
Well, this is great. You're advertising my book. You're advertising my podcast. Like, yeah. I'll come back here again. That's the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. Go to spirituallyincorrect.com, podcast.com.
There you go. My massive influencer powers are at work. It's great. No, I really do, like, not to blow too much smoke, but I love, I was really impressed that you guys interviewed a young earth creationist and an intelligent design, I love the really fair hearing you're giving to people. And the interview with the Catholic exorcist was fascinating. Like, I would have never been exposed to him probably if it wasn't for what you guys are doing there. I just really appreciate the broad-mindedness of your project. So,
well, I appreciate you saying that. We really, me and my co-host Seth Hart, we really aim to just give voice to everything that no one wants to talk about.
Yeah.
Whether that's, evolution, because we did a thing on evolution, or it's young earth creationism, or it's demons, or it's telepathy, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
I think we have this weird spiritual itch. It might actually be sinful in a weird way to discover whatever someone doesn't want to talk about and just talk.
I love it. I love that. And as you know, myself, I'm kind of in that large camp of formally fundamentalist that somehow never fully deconstructed. I'm still not exactly sure how that happened, but here I am. And so what all that means is that, like, when the podcast popped up of having a young earther on, I was like, oh, I don't want to listen to that. That was my initial reaction. I was like, I don't want to give that a fair hearing because of my baggage with that whole culture. But man, the person you found was really gracious and kind-hearted, and I thought articulated himself very well. And I was really actually edified by that conversation. So yeah, props. It's really good stuff.
Yeah. I think it's terrifying in a way that if you look long enough, you can find an intelligent person who knows what they're talking about, defending absolutely anything. And that's reaffirming. Like, it's like, oh, humanity exists everywhere. There's people in all sides, but it's also terrifying. Like, oh God, all positions have intelligent people behind them. What position should I take if I can't just dismiss people as
Yes.
stupid and then go the other direction.
That's
So
right. That's right. And there's something about that feeling of threat that I think is really important to pay attention to. And like, I endeavor to be a wise and hopefully spiritually mature enough person to not let the feeling that threatened feeling drive me, or like let that dictate my blind spots or things that I refuse to pay attention to. Like so I had a very just all I guess I'm always saying is I had like a very powerful crisis experience just in knowing you talked to a young earther before I even listened to the conversation. It was great.
yeah, I love that. I think I'm coming off as deeply like young earth creationist here, which I'm not at all.
Mm-mm-mm-mm-mm.
But no, I appreciate you saying
Me
that. And
neither. Yep.
I've felt awkward about doing that episode. And we've had all these people assume we're young earth creationists. And it's like, guys, we also did an episode on evolution,
Right.
theistic evolution. And like,
Right.
but I just was responding to a comment on YouTube today where the guy was just chewing us out for being so stupid about the young earth creationist thing. And I'm like, you realize we interviewed this person and asked them tough questions and then interviewed someone on the other perspective. And I
Yeah.
think things have just gotten so unnuanced that you can't
Yes.
even interview
Yeah.
someone or ask them questions without being dichotomized into one
Yeah.
side or the other, which is just crazy. It's
It
just crazy.
is. It's really malforming. And it's also like I think also part of it is the rhetoric and thinking about platforming voices, and like a lot of people make judgments about who should and shouldn't even be quote unquote platformed, and I think that feeds into all this too. And it's just really sad to me that we as a broad statement, but you know what I mean, like generally it does feel like it's harder to just create conversation spaces without being labeled or a lot of assumptions being made about you or whatever. But I want you to keep going because I love the space you're creating. Yeah, I do love the space you're carving out. And I think it's needed. Even if it's not, I don't know what most people would pressure you to do. But I love it. So here we are.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
So I'm here with. Do you go by JD or Jonathan? Does it matter to you?
In person, I go by Jonathan. It's
Okay,
just for the publishing name, they do
there you go.
JD because I think JD just sounds kind of cool, like JD Lyonhart, J.R.R.
Yeah,
Tolkien, N.T.
yeah, the,
Wright.
the two initials thing. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a good leg up. Yeah. Well, I'm here with Jonathan Lyonhart, the author of the, if you just saw him hold up the book, Monothreeism, also host of the Spiritually Incorrect podcast, which we've just been chatting about. And I do suspect those of you who, my humble little corner of the internet here, I suspect those of you who are watching this would probably really appreciate what Jonathan is doing over there. So check that out. But we're here to talk most about the book. And so I want to say right up front that I loved the book. I really did. I had a ton of fun reading it, but I also have been thinking about it for the past few weeks since I finished it. And I've been, I think, maybe annoying my wife by bringing it up constantly because it is such a great, well, we'll get into it. But I just want to say up front that I really loved it.
Well, I appreciate you saying that because I think it's good to know that the way it was created has continued to be perpetuated in how it's being thought of, because I too annoyed my wife while doing it. And so it brings me joy to hear that that's living on
Yeah,
in
good.
others.
Good. Yeah, that's your primary mission. That's excellent. So let's talk. The first question I have is really a pretty basic one. So if you're not familiar, if those watching aren't familiar with the book, the subtitle is an absurdly arrogant attempt to answer all the problems of the last 2,000 years in one night at a pub. And so the setup is it's a fictional dialogue. It reads like a screenplay. And I just want to ask, how did you come up with the idea to like frame it up that way? Why that form for this argument? Like, I would love to just hear the story behind that.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different things at play. It was easier than writing a theological treatise.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Um, and I think that's what I thought initially, but actually the creative process required so much more thinking through of character, and
Mm-hmm.
every line had to pop because
Yes.
this needs to be a dramatically engaging thing. So I think I thought it was easier than doing a theological treatise, but I don't think it actually ended up being.
Yeah.
The second thing is, in some ways, I very intentionally want to critique the genre of academic discourse.
Hmm.
I think this line between popular and academic serves its purpose in some contexts, but to some extent, I just don't know why it needs to be that way. I think beauty and truth should naturally
Mm.
merge. Uh, and I mean, I think that's very theological of me to say.
Yeah.
And so I think great works of thought are not just packaging themselves by putting on some beautiful, creative, dramatic stuff around them, but I think they're actually making themselves more true, more beautiful,
Mm.
more good, and more divine in
Mm.
doing that. And so I really,
Wow.
and I think part of that comes out of a theological conviction, but I think part of that also just comes out of a theological boredom. I'm
Hmm.
exhausted of reading these books that are just the dullest things ever, and they should be the most passionate,
Yeah.
exciting things ever, because they're talking about God. They're
Yeah.
talking about the infinite creator of centipedes, and like, but somehow they're just the dullest things ever.
Mm.
And so I'm very convicted about that on a personal level, that probably arises from my ADHD and my inability to listen to anyone or read anything that's boring for more than 20 seconds.
Mm.
Then finally, and this is an exhaustive answer, I'm doing exactly what I said
No, that's good.
other people doing. I'm getting very tedious in the interview.
No.
But the third point is that, ironically, so this is a Socratic dialogue between three
Hmm.
characters, and on the one hand, that's a very popular level conversational format, but it's actually the most ancient of academic
Right.
genres. That's the Socratic. It goes
It's a
back
good.
to Socrates, to Plato.
It's a good point.
And
Yeah.
so that's the one of arguably the most ancient genres of academic discourse, and it shouldn't be rehabilitated today, especially because I very rarely have an opinion that I just believe without
Mm.
nuance, without some sense that the other side is a little bit right. And I think the
Hmm.
Socratic dialogue allows me to state my positions while also being like, but this other stuff over here is really interesting too. And maybe, I don't know, we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah. I can definitely see how it the forum allows you to give voice to so many kind of different pressures or different ideas, or yeah, it's just like baked into the form itself, lets you kind of explore the tensions and let them exist. And there's a certain, I guess there's a confidence to the posture of the book that is really refreshing, in that you let those tensions there, in the way that the characters dialogue, which is, I think, part of why it's so fun about it. But it's also, so it was funny because when you said your initial thought was that it would be easier, my initial thought was like, I feel like it sounds a lot harder actually, because you are so concise too, in like the amount of stuff you move through. And by nature of it being, if anyone's watching this has read a script or a screenplay or something, there's a lot more white space just because of the form of it. And so it's a thin book with a lot more white space than most other academic books are, and yet you move through quite a lot. So yeah, it's interesting. My reaction is that I don't think it actually sounds like it would be any easier, let alone making it like sound like real people talking, which is itself a challenge. um so props on the form, props on putting out something that is very different. I would love, this might be too much of a rabbit trail, but you're in academia, and I'm curious if you sense that your frustration you've expressed with kind of the limits of the genre of academic writing, and how all these books that are come out are so dull, even though they're talking about the grandest mysteries of the universe. Like, is there a pressure in academic culture to keep things dry, keep things certain at a certain level of highbrow? Like, I don't know. You're the one in that world more than I am, so I'm curious if you think that that's a cultural systemic kind of thing.
I think on the one level, there's a pressure from the people rising up the ranks to
Yeah.
not do something that might make them look silly
Mm,
or
sure.
immature or too like youth pastory. And so I had one person tell me, "You're never going to get a job," when
Wow.
they saw that this book was coming out, because your first book as an academic is this
Mm.
popular level insane rant which occurs at a pub. Um, and uh, and I think there's a lot of pressure to be taken seriously, and I think
Mhm.
some of that's just, we put that on ourselves. And I know that, um, at Cambridge, where they sorry, at Cambridge.
Right,
Um,
right.
no, it's really hard not to sound like a jerk all the time. I think the type of people that go to Cambridge to do their graduate work are constantly, everyone's just having to know, we have to know everything. The
Yeah.
person who you're talking to, they start talking about Maximus or Thomas Aquinas or Nicholas
Mm.
Pisa, and it's just, you feel this, oh, I need to know what they're talking about. I need to go read that now. And it's,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and if you don't know what they're talking about, you need to pivot it to something you know about, even if the
I see.
pivot is really awkward and weird. And so you have these conversations between brilliant people where no one is making any sense. Because if they don't know what the other person is talking about, they have to pivot the
Yep.
conversation to something they do know what is being spoken about, because
Yeah.
they can't humbly enter in and be like, tell me
Yeah.
more. I haven't
Yeah.
heard that.
Yeah.
And so they always need to, there's that pressure. And
It's like everyone's got their peacock tail fully spread all the time. Yeah.
yeah.
And
And
the same
so,
thing happens, by the way, when pastors get together. So it's not
oh,
just not just
yeah.
academics.
Yeah. Like what is first, the Bible,
Hmm.
quoting Bible verses back to each other. I'm sure it is. And something I very intentionally did, I heard someone else who did this. And when we got to Cambridge, I felt that pressure and I felt myself starting to do that. And so something I very intentionally did was, anytime I didn't know what a word was or an idea was or a thinker or something, I would force myself to say, I haven't heard of that before.
Mm.
What is that? Which was so embarrassing. I
Mm.
like, but I think it was helpful. Uh,
Hmm.
and I actually think I learned more and had better conversations.
Oh, that makes
A lot
sense.
of these conversations where we were just jumping back and forth talking about what we already knew about.
Yeah.
Because that's safe. It's easy to talk about what you know about.
Hmm.
Um, so that was something I did very intentionally to try to survive that. I can't say I wasn't totally touched by it, because I was. There's still part of me that wants to be respectable. And I've found more friendly pastoral ways of one-upping other people. Um,
That's
but
great.
no, there definitely is that pressure. And
Makes sense.
yeah. So
Well, I appreciate the again the tone of the book. I appreciate that you're leaning against, in some ways, kind of going against the grain of all those cultural things you're talking about. And it's clear to me, I'm not somebody who's I'm decently well read, but I'm not philosophically trained. Definitely, some theological training, but it seems clear to me that you do have a certain amount of fluency, especially with classical Christian metaphysics, and especially classical Trinitarianism. And I just love to explore some of that, since that makes up kind of the backbone of your book. Um, so I would love, I mean, I guess I'd love to just start with how did you get around to the idea that I need to tackle all these apologetics issues by affirming classical Trinitarianism?
yeah, well, so I wasn't really raised in the sort of Christian culture. I'm from
Mm,
Vancouver, Canada, which is the least
okay.
church place in North America, and I wasn't Christian till later.
Hmm,
So I don't think I tackled it with an apologetics eye per
sure.
se, but it really started with, I just looked at the Trinity and I couldn't make sense of it when I was in high school.
Hmm.
And I also had the same problem with free will. And
Hmm.
when you start questioning free will, that's not just, oh, I'm not free, but are my choices meaningful? Does any choice I make matter? Does the universe have meaning?
Yeah.
There's a line there to nihilism.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was, and so I left high school with these deep questions. But then in my undergrad, I started to think about cosmology and the origins of the universe. And I realized that cosmology also doesn't make sense. When you look at how the universe began to exist,
Yeah.
reason just breaks down. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized it was breaking down for precisely the same reasons Trinitarian conversations broke down, and for precisely the same reasons discussions around free will broke down. There was
Hmm.
just this point where reason couldn't go. Um, the Trinity didn't make sense, but neither did the origins of the universe. So
Yeah.
perhaps the Trinity makes as much sense as our own existence. And
Yeah.
it's not just that one thing's absurd, so hey, let's go believe in anything. It was
Right.
that actually, when you looked at it very precisely, it was the exact same philosophical, theological conundrum in both contexts. It was the
Mm,
same question in how the origins of the universe began and in the Trinity, just in a different guise. One in the guise of theology, the other in the guise of cosmology.
hmm.
There's this moment where I'm like, okay, maybe the Trinity doesn't make sense, and maybe free will doesn't make sense, but neither does the existence of the universe. And yet somehow we still exist. So
Here we
perhaps
are.
those things make as much sense as our own existence. And so that was that moment of realization, which happened in a Pizza Hut in Joplin, Missouri, which has been torn down now. Uh, at a pizza buffet,
Oh
really,
man.
really elegant theological place, like
Yeah,
Augustine's garden.
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Like take up and chew. Um, I had that kind of realization where all three of those topics came
Wow.
together as actually the same topic, just in different language.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, I realized that that same tactic might be something I can do with all these other issues as well. I looked at the mind-body relationship in the book. I
Yeah.
looked at other religions. Uh, I look at,
Problem of
gosh,
evil.
problem of evil. Trying to even remember what I did. There's
You
a
talk
bunch of
about the maleness of God, is
yeah,
another issue.
masculinity, femininity.
Mm-hmm.
Even it even gets into questions of unity and diversity and
Yes.
sort of the stereotypical postmodern modern
Right.
questions. And
Right.
I basically realized that a lot of, if not most, I might even say most of the philosophical and theological issues we're dealing with come back to what I think of as this central problem, um, that we're starting with an ontology that can't hold together
Yeah.
multiple things. But I think that's what the Trinity beautifully does, is it
Yeah.
holds together being and becoming, unity and diversity, manyness and oneness. And I mean, theologians have been saying that for a while, but I don't think they've been allowing it to seep more foundationally into how they
Mm,
think of things, perhaps at an ontological level.
yeah.
I think that's a huge part of the new Trinitarian Ontologies project,
Mm,
that we're doing with John Milbank and Ryan
yeah.
Packer and Alex Avicina and Austin Stevenson, is really trying to rethink ontology in a Trinitarian fashion, and
Wow.
realize that the Trinity isn't one issue and then we deal with other issues. The Trinity is the issue
Mm-hmm.
which frames all the other
Mm-hmm.
issues, because that's the one who is at the heart of the universe and
Mm-hmm.
grounds it and structures it and everything. So
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, that resonates with me so much. One of my I guess sentence long takeaways from reading through your book was how everything is shot through with paradox. Like it's just but there's a way that you kind of boldly embrace the paradox, deep paradox, at the the root of all things by this robust definition of the Trinity. And man, it's weird to say that it's freeing, I think, because paradox seems like it would be the least freeing thing at first. But man, oh man, the way it's spelled out and the way you get at it, I would say it's deeply freeing. I found it um, really edifying, honestly. This is gonna turn into a gush fest about your book. So
well,
if
it's
I come up
okay.
with something,
Should I be paying you?
if I come up with something critical along the way, I'll try to bring it up. But I don't have much in mind right now. But yeah, on the paradox thing, I don't know. Would you say that's a fair way to kind of react to it, or?
Yeah, so I think the thing, I love what you just said, partially because it was gushing. But I'm a deeply rational person. And
Mm-hmm,
so the fact that the Trinity didn't make sense, the fact that free will didn't make sense, that was like a deal breaker for me.
mm,
Because I mean, I'm a philosopher, I'm a
yep.
theologian, but I'm also a philosopher. And if something doesn't make sense, that's kind of the breaking point for me. But what this process allowed me to do was realize that reason articulates its limits, and that
Mm,
sometimes the most rational thing to do is embrace the irrational. And that's what I think
it's good.
the tether of the Trinity to the origins of the universe allowed me to do, was say, okay, the Trinity and free will don't make sense, but they make as much sense as our own existence.
Right.
So they might not be rational, but they're as rational to believe in as the
Mm,
existence of anything at all. And so if I'm willing to just grant that, hey, I am here, this is
mm-hmm,
indeed real,
mm-hmm,
even though it doesn't make sense, we can actually sort of begin to pivot from there,
mm,
see what a universe like that would require,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
to also be the case. And so I feel not like I've just jumped into mystery and a Bardian rejection of philosophy. Rather,
Right.
I am trying to show how reason requires the irrational, and how the most rational thing to do is to proceed upon the mystery of the Trinitarian ontological foundation for everything.
So good.
And in that way, I found my rational side fulfilled, but also this otherness, this transcendence, this sense that God is beyond. And that tension is itself, I think, Trinitarian,
I
as
was
I
just
argue in
thinking
the
that.
book,
Yeah.
because Christ is the Logos. He's
Hmm.
rational, he's graspable. You can
Hmm.
reach out and touch him
Hmm.
2,000 years ago, and he's close and imminent and near. He's graspable. And yet he is one with the Father, who you cannot see directly in the face, or else you'll die in the Old
Hmm.
Testament,
Hmm.
who is eternal, transcendent, beyond the classical theist God. And so the Trinity itself holds this tension of the God who is the Logos and knowable, and the God who is transcendent, immutable, eternal, and beyond human comprehension. And yet
Hmm.
those are the same God.
Hmm.
Um, and so I guess in some ways, I would say a Trinitarian ontology simultaneously says the universe is rational through and through, and yet also not. And
Yes.
that paradox is freeing in some ways. It fulfills my reason, but it also goes beyond it.
Yeah.
And I think it's very Trinitarian. And there's one other thing I wanted to say, and I'm kind of just looping around until I find it again. Um,
Well, it's if I can just riff on that for a second, it's
Go ahead.
and maybe it'll come back to you, but yeah, I was thinking the exact same thing that even as you are articulating your rational journey through all this, that is in itself an example of how you display the kind of paradox at the heart of the Trinity is shot through everything. And so like the idea of ration and reason belong, and also there's limits and mystery, and also both to combined are true. Like that just it's just another example of kind of illuminating the dynamics that you're talking about. And it strikes me as I love the way you just put that, because I too am a very like uh well, I mean, I just love reading, I love learning, I'm like insatiably curious, and giving voice to proper kind of exploration of ration and reason within its even while acknowledging its limits is just really it's just really helpful, because I grew up way more immersed in evangelical borderline fundamentalist culture, it sounds like, than you did. And I wrestle a lot with the anti-intellectualism that is endemic in a lot of that culture. And so seeing examples of like what you just articulated in your book, and I could list a ton of other writers and stuff that do that as well, it's just really, really affirming and encouraging to someone like me, who feels like you're giving permission for ration, but also, or for rational thought, but also
No, I love
acknowledging
I
its
love
limits.
this. I love this rations and rationality,
Yeah,
like so as if there were almost this etymological connection between each of us gets a certain
yeah,
ration
that's good.
of
Yeah,
reason, and some of you will be given a better portion, a better ration, and some of you will be given very little
that's funny.
portions, very little rations. Sorry, I cut you off? Go
No,
ahead.
no, no, that's good. I realized I was saying that. Um, well, I would love to talk a little bit about your verbiage. So you develop being, becoming, and both. Is that your language? Is that something that you were inspired by another thinker to use? And I'd love to just unpack a little bit of those terms.
Yeah, well, just to speak to the language side of things, I think perhaps it was a stupid choice of terms to use because being has such a rich history
Mm,
in in the Greeks, in the scholastics, in Heidegger, in Aquinas. Like it's just but I chose it and I did it. It's too late now. So I basically framed the Trinity around this being, becoming, and then both.
is there another term, just really quickly? Is there another term you would use if you were to redo it now, or would you stick with it?
No, I mean I'd probably stick with it because I like the triple B's.
Yeah,
So I did ministry as well for a few years. So
gotta alliterate.
you got to a little like that's the
Yep.
preacher impulse within
Yeah.
us all. I like that the three B's. And so but I think I am using them in different ways from how they're
Yeah.
often used, and it might be better to think of them as atemporal, temporal, or both,
That's good.
um, or timeless, temporal, both.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because that's really the emphasis I'm getting at is the temporal side of things. And some people want to say, oh, it's not temporal, but it's causal, and they try to make those nuances. But if there was a word to encompass whatever's process, change, or time, whichever of those things you're gonna lean towards versus the other, that would be the word that I would
Mm.
use, becoming. Um, and I maybe I use becoming instead of time because so many people tend to fall into this trap of imagining processes occurring in God in a temporal ordering
Right.
before time exists.
Yes.
I wanted to maybe avoid that by using a different term than time.
Makes
So
sense. Makes total sense. That's actually, and I was debating bringing this up, and this might be another rabbit trail we don't necessarily go down, but um, it's so interesting. I've over the recent years, I would say, I've been kind of rediscovering these classical strains of Trinitarian thought. Like I love how David Bentley Hart talks about it in Beauty of the Infinite, for example. That was a has been a pretty big text for me in rediscovering some of these strains. And all I wanted to bring up was that the timepiece and what you just talked about processes within God and so on and so forth. I was for a long time, I spent a while fairly convinced of the open theist kind of account, um, which has a lot of compelling arguments, especially making sense of the biblical narrative, I would say. Um, I never fully went into process theology. I think a lot of people would take that, they step deeper into process thought. All I'm trying to say is that your book, along with along with some others, have just like clarified for me why I haven't ever been totally comfortable with open theism, honestly, because it seems to collapse it collapses God into time, I guess might be a fair way to say it. It certainly doesn't seem to have a place for the being or the atemporal part. Um, and there was something that just really clicked into place as I was reading your dialogue in your book of like, oh, that's what I'm missing. Like as the characters go back and forth about like, why when they start to defend the I think is it Vlad who's defending the temporal or the becoming part and is explaining what you lose when you don't have being in place anymore. And I just thought, oh my gosh, that's why I can't be an open theist. So it was very, very helpful. So I don't know if there's anything you want to comment on there, but I just wanted to give that as kind of part of my own personal reaction to your book.
no, in many ways that's part of what's behind this as well, is an attempt to appreciate that like process theology is missing something
Yeah.
of the absoluteness, the eternalness, the immutableness, the being
Yeah.
of the divine being. But also at the same time, the sense that, well, classical theism tends to make God so absolute that it's
Yes.
hard to see him as particular, as personal, as incarnate, as feeling emotions,
Mm-hmm.
or going for any of these processes, which he so clearly seems to do in the historical narrative of the Bible. And I guess in some ways I was trying to take the best of both of those and
Yeah.
paradoxically unite them in the paradox of the Trinity.
It's good.
So yeah,
Yeah.
very much at the heart of what you're saying is what I'm trying to say as well.
Oh man, that's helpful. Now, what about? Could you comment on the spirit? Because I could see how, and you get into this in the book too. I could see how it could be easy to just do a binitarian. I don't know if that's the right word. You could just do being and becoming. But what's the importance? Defend the role of the both, I guess.
Yeah, so I guess in a sense, I see the both. Well, it's hard if you haven't read the book because I'm
Sure.
using terms in a way that theology doesn't use them.
Mm.
And this is Heidegger's fault. I read too much Heidegger, and then I'm just like, I'm going to invent words.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, so uh, yeah, the bothness is I see the spirit as sort of you bringing together the Father and Son in a very sort of Augustinian way.
yeah. Mm.
Um, but I don't think they have some sort of ontological primacy or superiority over the spirit in my account, because without the spirit, they don't have that unity that
Yeah,
allows them to create the universe.
it's good.
Uh, because if they just existed on their own with the Son and the Father, but no overlap, then the Son would just be
Mm-hmm.
temporal, the Father would be eternal, and creation still would never begin because there would be no
Yeah,
meeting place.
yeah,
Um, Again, this will not make sense unless you've read the book.
yeah, yeah.
Um, but so for me, the Spirit is given a place that's as important as the Father and Son in the narrative, in a way that I feel like when you're doing rational addition, there's not really much space for the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like 49% the Son, 49%
Right.
the Father, 2% the Spirit. And I guess with the paradoxical borderline, I don't think it's a contradiction, but I think it currently seems like one. With the borderline contradiction paradoxical account that I'm putting forward here, it's 100% Father, 100% Son,
Yes.
100% Spirit.
Yes.
There's no that's what a contradiction, or at least a paradoxical seeming contradiction,
Yes.
allows us to affirm. And that's key. I don't say it is a contradiction. I say it
Seems like
can
one.
be
Yeah.
dismissed for currently seeming like one.
Yes.
Perhaps when we die, God will explain it to us, and we'll be like, "Oh." But anyways, I think the beauty of a genuinely seeming contradiction is
Hmm.
you really can say it is being and it is becoming, and it's
Hmm.
not 50% one, 50% the other.
Hmm.
It's 100% one, 100% the other, and 100% both.
Hmm.
And that bothness is where I think the Spirit is given the 100% that it's not usually given. It's usually
Yeah.
10% or 20%
Hmm.
or something
Hmm.
like that. And that makes sense when your rational accounts have the Father of being and the Son of becoming looming so large that
Yes.
there's no space for the Spirit to have anything else. But I think a paradoxical account can give the Father his due 100%, give the Son his due 100%, and then say the Spirit is also given 100% his due as both of them.
Hmm.
Uh, and that's just what the nature of a paradoxical, or at least seeming contradiction is.
Yeah.
Again, none of that will make sense unless you read the book. And
Yeah.
I'm doing what I hate theologians for doing, which is getting into this very minutia, nuanced, technical language. But hopefully the reason you'd read the book
Yes.
instead of just listening to this is because the book hopefully presents this in a much more relatable narrative
Yes.
story-based way,
Hmm.
whereas right now I'm just going on a rant.
No, no, no. It's good. I asked you to, so you're just going through that door. That's great. Well, this also makes me think of that. That was super helpful. That was really, really helpful explanation, and especially the point of the overlap between the being and the becoming, or the like that overlap. That overlap is so crucial, and it does make a lot of sense to me given the context of what I've read in the book. So I would heartily encourage watchers to pick it up so they also get that explanation. But what's also making me think of, I know we just need to keep flashing it.
Yeah.
What's making me think of too is like all the ancient iconography, or even not so ancient iconography, that shows like a large father, maybe the son sitting at his, at the feet of the throne or something, and then there's maybe a bird. That's the Spirit, like a tiny little like almost afterthought, which I think that reflects something of the way we tend to approach this or conceptualize it. But the 100% of all three is really helpful. And also just makes me want to ask too, because some of the pushback, I'm sure you've heard this, I'm sure you've wrestled with this, but like some of the pushback people will give is that this is too Greek, this is too Hellenistic, it's not Hebraic enough, and I know personally that's all over when I did a lot of deep study on the open theism and the adjacent worlds. That's a big critique, is that this is all just Hellenistic kind of taint into the history of the church that would have been better if we had never had any of that. How do you respond to that critique?
Well, I think uh
Have you heard that? I'm assuming you
oh
have.
yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think in some ways the Bible invites the Hellenistic into it by using terms like logos, but it
Yeah.
also goes beyond that. And so I think you need to have that tension.
Hmm.
And I suppose what I'm trying to do is say, well, I think these philosophical categories are helpful, but they break down at some point when we're talking about the Trinity, when we're talking about free will, and when we're talking about the origins of the universe.
Yeah.
So they have a place, but also we have to go beyond them. And so, yes, me putting the label of being, becoming, and both onto the Trinity might seem like imposing this massive philosophical structure where they have to fit into these neat little delineated philosophical cookie cutter lines. But actually, the whole point of my project is to say, but then those lines begin to bleed into each other in a way that is mysterious and
Yeah.
insane and relational and full of process, and
Yeah.
yet as rational as our own existence. And
Hmm.
so, in some ways, I actually think I'm doing the Greek project and subverting the Greek project, but I
Yeah.
see that just once again paralleling the paradox of the Trinity itself, because
Yes.
Christ is the Logos. You could say that in many ways there's a parallel to the Greek process there, and yet
Yeah.
within the Trinity itself, the Father is more of a transcendent figure who can't just be seen directly, grasped directly with
Yeah.
logical thinking with the mind.
Yeah.
So I see the tension within the Trinity itself as precisely the tension we need to have towards philosophy and reason.
It's good.
And I think we always think it's one or the other, but I think precisely what I'm advocating for is, well, it's actually
It's both. Yeah.
it's doing both. It's
Mm-hmm.
speaking the unspeakable. It's thinking the unthinkable, and that might not make sense, but it makes as much sense as our own existence.
Yeah. Always comes back to that. Yeah. And
And
man,
that's
I
our
love that.
tether. That's the tether, so that
Yeah.
it doesn't spiral into
Yes.
irrationality. Sorry, go
Right.
ahead.
No, that's good. So that's, you come back to that in the book too. You circle back to that as like, this is not licensed to just believe any hooey crazy idea that we can come up with. Like, this is putting everything kind of on. I see it as putting everything on intellectually even ground, like a lot of these arguments. It's not conceding that one is inherently more rational or more sensible than the others, right? Um, and what I was going to say too is that it's super helpful. I really love the way you're responding to these questions, because I'm even having things fall into place as I'm reacting. And one of the things that I was thinking as you were talking is when you use the phrase subverting the Greek project, like there is an element of subversion in there. And my hunch is that to just simply say, well, this is just Greek philosophical imposition on what we're supposed to believe is kind of a more Hebraic. I suspect that is a very global and historically limited view of human thought, because I'm sure that, to put it lightly, I'm sure the Greeks are not the only ones who have reflected deeply on the transcendent idea of a god. Like, I'm not an expert in Philo, but I know it's in Philo. I think that there's probably a lot of places that, outside of, I'm even thinking of I dipped into the Tao Te Ching at one point in my spiritual exploration. Like, I think there's probably a lot of examples of this stuff in philosophy around the world. That's not, it's just to say it's all Greek, that seems a little simplistic. So I don't know if you have a
Sure.
reaction to that.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And at a certain point, we've sort of, I've encountered some Bardians who basically define as Greek anything that is human,
Yeah.
or is anything that involves human thought. Um, and then it's sort of like, okay, so that on the one hand, I get what you're saying as a critique. You're trying to avoid Feuerbach and an anthropological projection, and
Right.
like you're trying not to just impose ourselves onto God, but you're also universalizing that human experience there and recognizing that,
Yeah.
that there is this human frame that we apply to things, and that
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
broadens it beyond the Greek.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. That resonates with me. Um, well, we're kind of getting close to the end of our time here, so I want to respect your time as well. I'd love to just ask, so for like, I'm a pastor. I have some seminary training. I don't have the deeper philosophical training that you do, and I suspect a lot of the people who will be maybe watching this might be in a similar boat. They're very interested at maybe a lay level, you could say. Um, other than your book, which everyone should read, what are some places you would point people towards, either patristics or current writers who are really helpful with some of this classical thought? Like, I would love to hear you riff on just what are some other places people can go
Uh
for this kind of level of rigorous thought.
yeah. So one book that I mean, it's difficult, especially on the Trinity, because it's like, well, read my book.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
but another book that might be close to what I'm doing, maybe not in what it's arguing, but in its playfulness, is
Hmm.
Delighting in the Trinity by
Oh yeah.
by Reeves.
Sure.
Um, that might be a good one. I'm I've yeah, that would probably be my first kind
Yeah.
of to thought there. So
Are there
I'm
any
not
patristics you would recommend people to start with, or is that not so much?
so it's not that there isn't great stuff there. It's just I haven't found many helpful introduction type
Mm,
works for the church level. I'm
yeah.
sure they exist, and someone's like, "Excuse me, I've got a whole shelf of it."
Yeah.
But I'm not thinking of anything
Sure.
off the top of my head.
Sure.
Um, but as soon as this conversation ends, I'll think of 10 things,
There you
and
go.
they'll
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
done
That's how.
for your edification, but not for the edification of the listening.
Perfect. That's really all I'm
So
doing all this for. Um,
yeah.
that's great. Well, what oh, one other thing I want to say about your book before we officially wrap. Um, I and I'm not going to say anything about it because I don't want to spoil anything for people, but I loved the way you ended it. It like caught me totally off guard. I thought I loved the book already, but that ending just kicked it up another level. And I just wanted to throw that out there for readers as well to hopefully intrigue people more, because I just thought that was absolutely perfect. Perfect way to stick the landing. So well done.
I appreciate
But
it.
now I'd love to just ask you, what are some things you're working on? Is there any more writing projects that are coming out? We'll point people to your podcast. What other things are you kind of involved with?
Yeah, so yeah, there's the Spiritually Incorrect podcast, which we do on YouTube. We do video, but we also do audio, Spotify, all the different types of things. So check that out, Spiritually Incorrect podcast. Um, as for research, there's 4 major book things I'm working on right now. The first one is Space God, Rejudging a Debate Between Moore, Newton, and Einstein.
Oh, wow.
That's hopefully coming out in the next few months,
Oh,
I think.
great.
That is on God's relationship to space in the 17th century, particularly in the Cambridge Platonist Henry Moore, and then in Isaac Newton.
Hmm.
And I'm basically looking at that account, and then I'm asking, so after Einstein relativizes space and time into space-time, does this account still have anything worth being said, or is it just
Oh,
destroyed
wow.
by 20th century physics? And so I relook at it in the light of contemporary science, but also I look at it to see, is this theologically orthodox? Is it philosophically coherent and interesting? And that's just sort of, yeah, basically that project is, how does God relate to space post Einstein?
Wow.
Which
That sounds awesome.
a lot of theologians have asked, how does God relate to time post
Mm-hmm.
Einstein? But I think this is a less explored direction. So that's
Yeah.
the first one. I think that's going to be much more academic than
Hmm.
monotheism. Monotheism was a dialogue. This is a proper academic thing,
Gotcha.
sort of thing I swore I wouldn't write. And then the
Who's
next
publishing
project,
it? You know?
so that is coming out with the studies. It's coming out with Cascade, but as part
Okay.
of a series that Ryan Mullins and John Peckham are
Oh.
editing.
Oh,
So
excellent. Okay, great.
studies in the doctrine of God, relational and classical theology.
Mm,
So that's the first thing that's coming out.
great.
The next one is New Trinitarian Ontologies, Volume 1 and 2. I'm co-editing Volume 1 with John Milbank and Ryan Hacker. And then Volume 2 is coming out, also, which will be co-edited by John, but then also Alex Abasina and
Mm,
Austin Stevenson. So that's hopefully coming out early 2024.
okay.
And then
That also sounds excellent. I'm looking forward to that.
great. And then getting back to the monothreism roots. Sorry, this is a much more elaborate answer than you probably
No, this
wanted.
is great.
I have a book called Zeus Was an Atheist.
Okay.
An odd, an odd, an odd retelling of the Moses story, and that's more in line with monothreism.
Mm,
That's that's probably, if you liked monothreism, that's going to be the closest genre to that. It's a
gotcha.
monologue from Moses's perspective, where he basically goes off debating all these other gods he's encountering, and I sort of make an anachronistic imposition of the Greek world backwards a bit, which is
Mm-hmm,
a bit of a scholarly leap, but I did it
mm-hmm.
for a good philosophical theological reason. It's basically Moses arguing with himself for a book.
Mm,
And the final thing, which I'm excited about, which is coming out with IVP Academic,
hmm.
is it's just going to be sort of an introduction to Christian theology, but
Oh,
written in the sort of zany style of monothreism. It's not going to be necessarily a dialogue per se, but the goal is for it to be absolutely bonkers in
okay.
style and genre and content. And I'm regularly having my wife say, "You can't write that down in a." And so that's I'm having a lot of fun with that, and that's probably the closest to my heart and enjoyment is
Oh,
that.
excellent.
So that's, I you can see the ADHD coming out in that I can never focus on one project. There's
Those
got
are
to be,
four
yeah,
very different projects.
we'll
Yeah.
see if any of them ever actually come out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like to just sort of be bouncing around. I get
Yeah.
bored very quickly.
It
So
sounds like the book with IVP is probably the farthest from publication. Is that accurate at this point, or?
theoretically it should be,
Okay.
based on all contractual and legal obligations. But the
Sure.
problem with ADHD is when you start to hyperfocus, it's very hard to
Mm,
stop. And
mm,
so I think that one actually might be coming out before some of the other
that's
ones.
funny.
I'm not contractually obligated to do further out, like,
Yeah, yeah.
so that'll get me in trouble.
Well, IVP sounds like a great home for that book. I'm excited you get to express some of your humor in that
Yeah.
kind of subject as well. So that'll be fun. I'll be looking forward to that.
Well,
All
well,
right.
thanks for asking. Nobody gives me permission to just rant on about what I'm doing. This is great.
Well, my channel is literally called Books and Big Ideas. So if I didn't do that, I would be doing a disservice to myself and my humble audience. So I really do think that the folks listening would be and watching would be really intrigued by what you just delineated. Well, thank you. Thanks for spending some time with me to talk about this stuff. I really do appreciate your project. I appreciate your humor and your posture in all these questions. I think it's really. I just think that stuff you're doing is very timely, very and a great service to the church, truly. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate you having me on here. It's been lovely to meet you and talk with you. And so all the best.
Thank you.